I always thought I'd grow old in that house. It sat on a quiet ridge just outside the city, where you could hear the wind rustling through the pines before the sun even cleared the horizon. My wife and I bought the place when we were young, with big dreams and not much else. The yard was rough back then, just rocks and weeds, but I planted every tree myself, 5 oaks along the southern edge. Over the years, they grew tall and strong, just like we did. I buried my wife under those trees. Not literally, her ashes are in a box on my mantle, but it's where I go when I need to feel her near. She used to sit under the biggest oak, with a book in her lap and iced tea in hand, barefoot in the grass, humming softly to herself. I can still hear it sometimes, even now. I never had any issues with neighbors. Folks kept to themselves, nodded from across fences, shared the occasional tool or casserole. Peaceful, quiet. And then he moved in. His name was Connors something, mid-30s, real estate developer, all charm and Rolex watches. Bought the newly built mansion next door, tore up the land for a pool and an outdoor kitchen before he even unpacked. From the moment he arrived, I knew it. We were not going to get along. It wasn't the late-night parties or the constant hum of landscapers that got to me. It was the way he looked at my land, like it was in his way, like my trees, my boundary, were an inconvenience to his precious view. I remember that day like it was burned into me. I'd just come home from picking up groceries. The sun was high, and the sound of chainsaws pierced the air. I froze on my front step. Something felt off. The usual quiet of the ridge had been replaced with shouting and power tools. I walked around the side of the house and stopped cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the fan creaking overhead like it was mocking me. The quiet that used to bring me peace now felt heavy, like something was pressing down on my chest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those trees, my trees, lying lifeless on the ground. I saw Connor's smug face and heard his words echoing again and again. Just cleaning up the view a little. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like erasing part of my history was some casual improvement project. And the worst part? He wasn't even hiding it. He knew exactly what he was doing. Still, part of me didn't want to fight. I'd been through enough in my life. Lost my wife to cancer after a 5-year battle, raised 2 kids mostly on my own. Worked 38 years at the same company, never got into legal trouble, never raised my voice unless I had to. I wasn't built for drama. I wanted peace. What am I gonna do? I mumbled to myself in the dark. Sue a real estate developer with money to burn? The thought made my stomach turn. Guys like Connor didn't lose. They delayed, they appealed. They buried you in paperwork and lawyers until you either broke or gave up. And me? I was just an old man with a boundary line and a broken heart. So for a few days, I did nothing. I mowed the lawn like always, sat on the porch with my coffee, nodded to the mailman, pretended the stumps weren't there. When I looked toward the edge of the yard, I kept my eyes low. It was easier that way. But the weight wouldn't leave. Every time I stepped outside, the absence screamed at me. The wind didn't sound the same without leaves to move through. The light hit the house differently. The shade was gone. And the worst part? He'd left the stumps. I'm not the kind of man who acts on impulse. I don't slam doors. I don't raise my voice. I've spent a lifetime learning that real strength isn't loud. It's patient. And after that night, sitting alone with my wife's letter and a stack of old land records, something in me had finally settled. I wasn't going to explode. I was going to execute. First, I made a copy of every document we had from the original land purchase, the plat map, the deed, the boundary agreements signed with the previous owner, even the emails we exchanged with the surveyor back in 2003. I organized them neatly, labeled every folder, and set them aside on my kitchen table. Then I made a call. Not to Connor, to the county recorder's office. I asked for a copy of the most recent survey filed when Connor purchased the adjacent lot. The clerk hesitated, then told me I could request it under public records. I drove into town the next morning, wore my cleanest shirt, shook hands, smiled politely. Got everything I needed in under 30 minutes. When I got back home, I laid the two surveys side by side. There it was, clear as day. The oaks, the ones he cut, stood a full 6 feet inside my property line. He hadn't just trimmed a few branches or cut down trees that straddled the line. He'd authorized the removal of mature, protected trees that sat entirely on my land. And he'd done it without asking, without warning, without permission. That changed everything. I called in a second opinion, a local surveyor who'd worked in the area for years. Told him I needed confirmation, quietly, discreetly. He came out 2 days later, polite and thorough, and when he finished, he just shook his head. "Those trees were yours," he said. "No question." I nodded. "Can you put that—"
3 weeks passed before I heard anything back. I kept my days quiet, routine. I mowed the lawn, restacked the firewood, fixed the squeaky hinge on the back door. Nothing in my behavior changed, at least not from the outside. But every morning, I checked my email and my mailbox like clockwork. And then, one Monday afternoon, it started. A letter arrived from the county's Department of Environmental Services, certified, official seal. Inside, it stated that an investigation had been opened regarding the unlawful removal of protected oak trees within a conservation boundary. They thanked me for the documentation and said a site visit was being scheduled. I sat on the porch holding that letter for a long time. It was working. I didn't smile, not yet, but I felt a stillness inside me, the kind you feel when you know you've chosen the right path, even if no one's watching. 3 days later, a black SUV pulled into Connor's driveway. 2 county inspectors stepped out, hard hats in hand, clipboards under their arms. I watched from behind the curtain as they walked the property line, pointed at the stumps, jotted notes. Connor came out halfway through, shirtless, holding a smoothie. He looked confused, annoyed. He gestured toward my house. I stayed right where I was. One of the inspectors knocked on my door later that day. He introduced himself, handed me a business card, and asked if I had a few minutes to walk the line with him. I agreed. We moved slowly, carefully. I showed him the surveys, the photos, the stumps, the drone images. He nodded at each one, quietly, professionally. "We're dealing with a serious violation here," he said. I figured. That's why I documented everything. He gave a half smile. Most people don't. I didn't tell him this wasn't about people. This was about one man. A week later, I saw Connor again, this time standing at the edge of his property, pacing on the phone. He was tense, barking into the receiver, pointing at the trees like he was trying to make the whole thing disappear through volume. But he couldn't yell this one away. The city had rules, and the more I read, the more I realized how badly he'd stepped in it. Turns out, Connor's outdoor kitchen, the one he'd been building just past the tree line, was encroaching into protected setback territory. You couldn't build permanent structures that close to the conservation zone without filing for a variance. And guess what? He hadn't. I found that out after one polite conversation with a woman in zoning. I didn't push her, just asked questions, took notes. It wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about the arrogance, the assumption that money bought space, that charm canceled boundaries, that I'd roll over and let him redraw my world to fit his. I didn't need revenge. I needed correction. That's what the inspectors were for. And they came back, twice. Connor started trying to act friendly, waving when I got the mail, calling out, "Hey neighbor," like we were in some sitcom. But his eyes told the truth. He was nervous. He didn't know what I knew. Didn't know how deep I'd gone, how many photos, letters, maps I had stacked in folders, how many questions I'd asked, how many quiet hands had nodded in agreement with me. He thought I was just an old man with too much time on his hands. He was half right, but I also had patience. And I had the law on my side.
The next envelope wasn't from the county. It was from Connor's lawyer. Thick, expensive-looking paper, the kind designed to make people nervous. The letter was written in that overly polite legal tone, filled with phrases like alleged encroachment and potential defamation. In short, they were accusing me of making false claims about Connor's property rights and suggested that if I didn't cease further interference, they'd consider pursuing appropriate legal remedies. I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in my drawer, right next to my own stack of neatly organized records, surveys, and time-stamped photos. I wasn't rattled. Not because I thought he wouldn't follow through, but because I already knew how this would play out. Lawyers can throw around big words, but in the end, truth weighs more than threats, and I had the truth. Still, it was a signal. He was getting scared. The next week, I noticed little things. A new no trespassing sign went up on his side of the fence. His workers, usually loud and confident, suddenly avoided eye contact when I walked by. One of the trucks that used to idle near the property line was gone for good. And Connor, he stopped waving. Instead, he watched. I caught him once, just standing there, arms crossed, staring at my house like he was trying to see through the walls, like if he glared hard enough, I'd back off. But I didn't. What he didn't know was that the inspectors weren't finished. The second visit had raised more red flags. The county had found that not only had he destroyed protected trees, but he'd also failed to disclose a retaining wall installation that required a separate permit, one that hadn't even been filed. And because the lot was on a slope, that structure posed a potential runoff hazard, which triggered an entirely different branch of environmental review. The dominoes were falling, and I wasn't the one pushing them anymore. Then came the knock on my door. It was Connor. First time he'd stood on my porch since the trees came down. He looked smaller, less confident. The shirt was crisp, but the face was tight. He smiled, too wide, and held out his hand. "Hey, just wanted to clear the air. I think there's been some miscommunication. Maybe we can talk this through, man to man?" I didn't shake his hand. Everything I needed to say is already in the documents. Calm, clear, not angry, just done. He lowered his hand slowly. "Look, I get it. The trees, the boundary, maybe things got a little out of hand. But we're neighbors. There's no reason to make this a war." "It's not a war. It's just Accountability. He looked at me for a long time. No more smile, no more charm. Just silence. Then he turned and walked away. That night, I added a new folder to the drawer, labeled it Intimidation Attempt. Inside, I wrote a short memo. July 12, verbal visit from opposing party. Tone, conciliatory, shifting to dismissive. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being thorough, because I knew where this was going. Connor thought he could scare me into backing off, but he didn't realize something important. I'd already lost more in life than he could take from me. He was messing with an old man who had nothing to prove, but everything to protect. I knew something had shifted the moment I saw the city truck. Bright orange logo on the side, parked at the base of Connor's driveway. Two men in reflective vests were taking measurements near the conservation line, one of them with a laser level, the other jotting notes onto a clipboard. I didn't need to ask what they were doing. The county was preparing a formal enforcement action. From my porch, it looked almost surgical, precise, measured, emotionless. Like a quiet reckoning had arrived in the form of city employees with rulers and forms. Connor stood nearby, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't look at me this time. He didn't wave. He just watched them like a man waiting on a verdict. And he was. The very next morning, he received a notice of violation. How do I know? Because a copy was sent to me as the adjoining landowner. I sat at my kitchen table, holding the letter, reading it line by line. Failure to obtain proper permits for land alteration within a conservation zone. Destruction of protected trees without municipal clearance. Unauthorized structure construction in restricted area. 30 days to comply, or face formal demolition proceedings and daily fines. I didn't smile, but I felt something deeper, like justice had finally caught up to someone who thought he could outrun it. Connor's reaction came quickly. Contractors started showing up early, some of them unfamiliar. I watched as they walked the property with clipboards and phones, gesturing, arguing. At one point, a man in a suit showed up, probably from his legal team, and they disappeared inside for hours. When they came out, Connor looked wrecked. His shoulders slumped, his eyes sunken. That confidence, that arrogance, it had evaporated, replaced by the quiet panic of a man who realizes that money can only delay the inevitable, not erase it. Later that week, I got a call from the inspector I'd spoken with early on. He thanked me again for the thorough documentation, said the case was being escalated to the city attorney's office due to the multiple overlapping violations. They're not just looking at fines anymore, he said. Depending on how he responds, this could lead to forced removal of the illegal structures, possibly more. I said nothing. I didn't need to. By then, Connor had stopped pretending we were neighbors. No more waves, no more phony smiles, just cold silence between two properties, one of them still whole, the other one cracked at the foundation. One afternoon, I stepped outside to refill the bird feeder and saw him pacing on his deck. He was on the phone again. Fast, clipped sentences, one hand slicing through the air. Then he stopped. His eyes met mine. We stood like that for a few seconds, just looking. No words, no gestures, just the weight of everything he'd set in motion, finally pressing down. He looked away first. That evening, the lights in his outdoor kitchen stayed off for the first time in months. The ridge was quiet again. Not peaceful, not yet, but quieter. I sat under what was left of the old oak line on the edge of my property and thought about my wife, thought about how she would have handled it. I imagined her voice, calm but clear. "You stood your ground," she would have said. "You protected what mattered." And maybe for the first time since the trees came down, I believed it. Connor thought he was dealing with someone easy to push aside, but he didn't see the storm building behind the silence. He didn't realize that I wasn't fighting for revenge. I was fighting for what was right.
The demolition order came on a Tuesday. It wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no warning shot, just the plain envelope from the city taped to Connor's gate. I saw it as I walked down to get my mail, that bright orange sticker with bold black letters, "Order to comply, final notice." He had 10 days. 10 days to dismantle everything he'd built illegally. The deck, the outdoor kitchen, the retaining wall, all of it. If he didn't comply, the city would bring in their own crew, and the cost would be billed directly to him, with interest. By the end of the week, it began. I watched from my porch as workers showed up with crowbars and power tools, not to build, but to tear down. Gone were the sleek patio furniture sets and the glistening marble counters. Gone was the wraparound deck that pushed too close to the conservation line. Piece by piece, they took it all apart. Connor wasn't there for most of it. I imagine he couldn't stomach it. But one afternoon, I did see him. He stood at the top of his driveway, arms folded, watching as the stone facade of his outdoor kitchen was pulled away. The same place where he used to host parties, blast music, show off to guests, now reduced to rubble and dust. He didn't say anything, didn't look at me, but I saw his jaw tighten, his hands ball into fists. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back into the house. That night, the ridge was quieter than it had been in months. No lights, no music, just the sound of crickets and wind and the familiar rustle of trees, the few that were still standing. I sat in my usual spot, coffee in hand, and breathed. Not in triumph, not in celebration, in restoration. The trees will take years to grow. That's the truth no one tells you when you plant something. It requires patience and a little faith. The saplings I placed near the old stumps are barely taller than my waist. But when I sit on the porch now, coffee in hand, I look at them not for what they are, but for what they'll become. Just like everything else I rebuilt. Connor's house eventually sold for far less than he paid. The listing sat on the market for months until someone from out of state picked it up, likely unaware of the full history. That's fine. I wasn't interested in gossip. What mattered to me wasn't who moved in, but what they didn't try to take. The new neighbors were different. On their first week, the husband walked over with a folder full of maps and asked me to confirm the property line. No arrogance, no assumptions. Just a man wanting to start right. I walked the line with him myself, pointed out the markers, even told him about the ridge's conservation rules. He listened. That's all I ever wanted. For someone to understand that land has meaning, that boundaries are more than lines on paper. They hold stories and history and love that people like Connor could never see through their tinted glass doors. And me? I sleep better now. Not because I won, not because his luxury deck was ripped apart, or because the city forced his hand. I sleep better because I didn't become like him. I could have shouted, could have threatened, retaliated, played dirty, but I didn't. I let the law speak. I let the silence do the heavy lifting.
I trusted in the weight of evidence and the strength of doing things right, even when it takes longer. That's something I learned the hard way in life. People will test you. They'll cross lines to see if you'll move yours. But if you hold steady, not out of spite, but out of principle, you'll find something stronger than revenge. You'll find peace. One afternoon, I stood by the 2 new trees and looked out at the lake. The view was different now. Not clearer, just quieter. The scars in the soil were healing. The air felt still. And for a moment, I thought of her again, my wife, sitting barefoot under the old oaks, humming softly to herself. I whispered, "We kept it safe." Because we did. And someday, long after I'm gone, maybe another family will sit under these new trees. Maybe they'll never know what happened here. Maybe they'll think it's always been this way. That's okay. Some victories aren't meant to be noticed. They're meant to be lived.